reunion of us. I will spare the details of how I got to know Eric as 5 years my senior at school. So my name is, in the interest of time, I'm going to dive straight into my story, which is about how God has set me free from the slavery of money. My name is Roger Lamb. I'm a fourth generation Christian. I was in the banking and finance industry for 25 years. God has put me on a roller coaster journey with money all my life. And it really started with my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was a very generous man. He started a very famous paint company in Hong Kong in the 1930s. And I was very proud of the family brand. And growing up, I just assumed that one day when I grew up, I would inherit the business and work there. And that was that's where my sense of security kind of came from. Even though I had gone to church all my life, I didn't have a real personal relationship with Jesus. So my foundation of sense of security was based on that instead. So all of that was true until I was 13 years old. Now, after my grandfather passed away, he had only given 10% of the family shares to my dad, who was running the business for him. My granduncle and his sons, who collectively owned more shares than my dad, they pulled in an outside businessman to launch a hostile takeover on the family business. My dad fought them for about a year, and then he narrowly lost out. So at the age of 14, I was painfully aware of a few things. I had lost my birthright. There's no succession rights anymore. My sense of security is gone. My dad had to tender his shares at a poor valuation. I was aware down to the last penny how much cash he got in his bank account. And to make matters even more complicated, he decided to leave Hong Kong because he felt there was nothing left for him to do here. So our family of four moved to Vancouver in Canada. So once we moved, I had a 180-degree personality change. I was completely driven by fear and anger because of the loss of the family business. I had bottled it up really, really well because my parents did not know that it was bothering me this much. But I knew that I had to take matters into my own hands now. I could no longer count on my parents. I could no longer count on a family business for my future. So I treated all my new peers as potential enemies. I felt that I had to defeat all of them before I would even have a remote chance of having having a chance for revenge or success. And that kind of negative energy worked pretty well. I mean, it got me very good grades. From an obscure public school in West Vancouver, it got me into Cornell University. And I probably brought the same kind of bad attitude with me to Cornell. And again, imagining that everyone there is a threat, it's an enemy, and that I had to basically crush everyone academically in order to stand a chance to make a comeback for myself. So when it was time to get a job in senior year, even though I did really well in school, I had a lot of difficulties because when you interview for a job, using your GPA to get past the first and second round interview is one thing, but your EQ also matters. I suspect that my EQ was so off that a lot of employers, they're actually really smart. 49 out of 50 employers dinged me. I got to a lot of final round interviews for many top-notch institutions in banking and consulting, but I think they could tell that there's something really wrong with this kid. He's not going to fit into any training program of ours. So I basically I didn't get a job for the longest time until there was only one job left, and it was the only job I did not apply for in New York or Hong Kong. It was in Chicago, And I did not know what a hedge fund was. I did not really know what a trader does, and I certainly had no idea what convertible bonds or equity derivatives are. But even though I did not have a personal relationship with Jesus, um, even though my heart was a million miles away from him, he had never left me or forsaken me. And he placed me in the best possible starting salaried job for the whole of Cornell undergrads in the year 1993. So fast forward the first 10 years of my career, which in hindsight was relatively smooth sailing. All I cared about was making money and getting promoted as fast as I can. I did not have any cares about other people's feelings. I did not have about anything else really. And my bank account became my source of security. By 2002, I had already moved back to Hong Kong, and my parents invited me to worship with them at Community Church Hong Kong, which where I still serve and worship at today. There, I ran into an ex-colleague of mine from the mid-90s from a Swiss investment bank. And this lady is really interesting. Every time I see her, the first thing that comes out of her mouth is, "Will you come to my Bible study?" Now, quite frankly, at that point, I was not ready to be part of any small group to divulge my innermost secrets to anyone. So I just kept making up excuses, saying that either I'm busy or I'm traveling next week, so on and so forth. A year went by, and then it was the year of SARS when in '03 when it hit Hong Kong hard. Within 24 hours, I suffered from two major personal setbacks. One was in my area of work, and the other was in my personal relationship with a young lady. I felt super depressed. I felt worse than I did when I was 14 when I lost the family business, probably because as a young adult of 31 years old, I had achieved a fair amount of success under my belt, and it was all, relying on my own hands. And when it failed, it felt much worse than than I was as a teenager when I was really just a innocent bystander, which there was nothing I could do about the situation. So that Sunday, I go to church, and who do I run into? That same lady from the Swiss bank from the mid '90s. And what's the first thing that flies out of her mouth? "Will you come to my Bible study?" And at that point, I was thinking, well, Roger, you're in the pits. What's so scary about this Bible study? So I think to her surprise, to my surprise, I asked her, where is it? When is it? I'll be there. And this has got to be one of the biggest changing moments in my life. God had given me a gentle wake-up call to really draw me back to Him and to start an intimate personal relationship with Him. It was the first time in my life where I actually had to pay attention and listen to other people's problems. So it was a sharp departure from my previous narcissistic existence, where 100% of my attention and effort was focused on myself, on how I would advance and how I would do better, et cetera, et cetera. Another sharp um, Another sharp departure from my previous existence is that there were some outreach activities organized by the Bible study. And I still remember very clearly the first time I went to visit an elderly gentleman. He was just discharged from hospice. And so he wasn't, his health was not in great shape. He was living by himself in a really small flat. It was not very clean. All I brought with me was a small little care bag with a lot of goodies in it. And I just sat down with him, had a cup of tea, chatted for 15 minutes. And it made him so happy. And I was astounded that how much joy that actually brought me. So that started to, also alter my definition of success. It was no longer just about making a lot of money. It was no longer just about getting promoted really quickly, but also the fact that I could make someone happy, like someone like that happy, that also brought me a lot of joy. And I considered that to be a success also. So basically, you know, from '03 onwards, for the next year or two, I learned to love God. I learned to love others. I learned to spend a lot of time serving the church and serving the community. But my deepest hurt was still in the area of money and provision. And God is so faithful, He is so merciful to me that He was willing to spend 10 years to teach me one Bible verse, which I believe is printed in your bulletin today. That Bible verse is probably familiar with a lot of you. It's Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Essentially, God taught me in money terms what it means to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with Him. And this three-part journey became my source of healing from my brokenness with over my fear of money and provision. And today I like to spend a fair amount of time um, to, um, to 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 walk you through this journey. So in 2005, when this journey first began, my pastor at the time, it was the first time ever that I heard a full-length sermon on tithing. It's a bit surprising given that I've been going to church for like more than 3 decades, and it was only the first time I heard a full-length sermon on tithing. He quoted Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, which is a classic stewardship verse, and which basically, and my pastor highlighted that this is the only area in the whole Bible where God invites you to test Him. Because anywhere else in the Bible, if you test God, something bad happens, like something really bad happens. So right there and then, after I heard the sermon, I made a very counterintuitive and uneducated decision. I decided that, well, given that I wasn't really paying attention to living out my life in according to biblical standards in any area of my life at the time, I just thought, well, why don't we take money and possessions to be the first area in my life that I would live according to biblical teaching. That was extremely uneducated of a decision because, as it turned out, I only after a decade later, I found out that money and possessions is actually the single largest percentage topic in the whole Bible. So inadvertently, I had signed up to obey God in the largest area in the whole Bible. So given that given that the text basically says, you know, God says you can test me in this, I took the liberty of testing Him. And how I did that was as follows. I filled out an autopay form to tithe a part of my base salary to the church right immediately. But the first month, I only wrote down 1% of my base salary. No, it definitely didn't hurt, didn't feel the pinch. And so the second month I went back and I changed the autopay form. The second month I changed it to 2%. And that month went by and still didn't feel any pinch. So the third month, in the interest of time, I increased the pace. I made it 5% of my base salary and I still didn't feel any pain. So by the fourth month, as you can probably guess, I changed it to 10% of my base salary. And I was filled with spiritual pride. I was thinking, Roger, well done. You're now living according to biblical teaching in the area of money and possessions. And how wrong I was. Anytime I sense this any kind of like foolish spiritual pride, God would then show me the next homework. A few months later, it was year end. And back in 2005, investment banking bonuses was still very robust. So when I saw my bonus number, I was like, do I have to tithe on this as well? And what added to the complexity was the fact that a part of it was cash, which is easy to deal with, because once it hits your account, I could do whatever with it. And then the other portion was in shares, and these shares were not vested or delivered to my hands for quite some time. It varied from 1 to 3 years. So my first bonus season, I have to confess, I had some muddled prosperity gospel thinking blended into what I tried to do. So I said to God, okay, Lord, I'm going to prepay the tithe even on the share portion which is not vested yet. Now, I'm not being greedy. I'm not asking you for the help the share price to double or triple, but as a minimum, if I prepay my tithe, would you be so kind to put a floor or put a protection on the downside for the share price so that it won't tank? Now, very soon I discovered that God doesn't work like that. The share price tanked, and basically, in the interest of time, I'm just going to say that it took me 2 full seasons to learn how to tithe properly, which is to give the 10% in value whenever it reached my hands. So the share portion in the second year, I only tithed the value when it became vested, when it became available for sale in my hands. Whether I actually sold the shares or not, that's another question. Now, why would I say that learning to tithe in full corresponds to the first part of Micah 6:8, which is to act justly? And that's because of 2 verses prior to Malachi 3:10. In Malachi 3:8, God was livid. He said to man, "You're robbing me." And then lowly man says, "Well, how can I rob you? You're God." And then God said to lowly man, "By not tithing, you are robbing me." So I justified that in money terms, as a bare minimum, to even claim that you're remotely acting justly is to tithe in full on your pre-tax income and bring it to your place of worship. So that's lesson number 1. As you can imagine, I was filled with spiritual pride after discovering through some fancy analytics that I was actually tithing the most at my church. And every time, like I said, every time I feel this kind of like foolish spiritual pride, God would then show me the next homework. So in 2007, one Sunday, my pastor said to me, "There's a gentleman at church. I would like you to meet with him. He's got some money problems. I would like you to hear him out to see what we can do for him." So I got to my pastor's office. It was my pastor. It was this gentleman, and it was just he only invited me to attend this meeting, which I was a little bit surprised about. It turns out that this brother borrowed 3 years worth of his wages from a loan shark, and the loan shark threatened to hurt him physically if he didn't repay in full within 72 hours. So I thought, well, someone's life is at stake here. This doesn't appear to be the type of situation where you could circulate by email to a committee and decide on whether to help this guy or not. And God had blessed me with the ability to help him on this amount. So, and I was really naive. I thought that, well, this is done in church. God had brought you to this opportunity, and your pastor is the witness. I never even thought, it never even crossed my mind that he could potentially default on my financial assistance to him. So out of my naivety, I only asked him 3 due diligence questions. I said, number 1, the money that you borrowed, is it for drugs? He said, no. I said, number 2, the money that you borrowed, is it for gambling? He said, no. I said, number 3, is this the full amount that will save your life? And he said, yes. And so now at that point, I wasn't all that familiar with the Old Testament of the Bible, but the terms that I came up with, a Levitical priest would have gone check on all the terms. So this is what I offered to him. I will lend you the amount in full so you could pay back the loan shark. I will charge you no interest, and arbitrarily, let's split the repayment over 5 years, over 60 monthly installments. And I asked him point blank, is this affordable to you on a monthly basis without stretching your finances? And he said, yes, this is very generous of you. So I just took that at face value. I thought that, well, my downside, my opportunity cost is not being able to invest this money for an average duration of 2.5 years. But I didn't even think for a moment that he would default on this for the reasons I already shared. In the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward to the 24th month. He stopped repaying me. The first 12 months was perfect. Every first Sunday of the month, he would give me an envelope, and then the repayments start to slow. And then all the way by the end of the second year, by the 24th month, the repayments just stopped altogether. The most bizarre decision that this gentleman made was the fact that he chose to stay at my church. So every Sunday I would see him. And whenever I see him, sometimes some negative emotions would be stirred up in my heart. Now, this was the real homework. Sometimes I would feel angry, and I would think to myself, am I allowed to be angry? Am I allowed to sit him down and question him what's going on with the loan? And if I do sit him down, with what kind of attitude am I allowed to speak to him in? And this gave me so much wrestling material in my heart. And in the meantime, I also became more familiar with the Bible, and especially the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew chapter 18 spoke to me very loudly. Basically, if I were to choose to be mean to this brother who owes me a little bit of money, then basically I would be inviting the Lord Jesus to be mean to me. Now that's not very clever, right? So so I just decided I cannot be angry to him, I cannot badmouth him, I cannot give him dirty looks, and I just decided to wait. And then a long time elapsed until one Sunday, out of the blue, I still remember exactly where I was standing at church. Out of nowhere, I hear this voice in my head. It was God speaking to me. The Holy Spirit asked me, when did you lend money to this brother? And I had to whip out my BlackBerry and the time, look through the calendar, and it took me about half a minute to answer the question. So I responded to the Lord. I said, Lord, I lent money to him in 2007. That day was in the year 2014. At that point, I became much better versed with the Old Testament of the Bible. Immediately, I knew exactly why the Lord had chosen to speak to me directly for the first time. That was the 7th year. In the Old Testament of the Bible, the 7th year is the year of debt forgiveness. So essentially, the Lord was asking me, are you willing to obey my teaching and forgive this brother of his debt that's been non-performing for a good number of years already? Basically, I decided that if the God who created the whole heaven and earth and the whole universe chooses to speak to me directly for the first time, and if I do not respond favorably to him, then that's basically not giving him any face, right? That's not very clever. So right there and then, I decided that I had to cancel the debt with that brother. And I walked up to him and I said, you don't owe me anything anymore. Let's rip up the ticket. Friends, I'm pleased to report to you that today we are still very good friends. He's still at my church, and that he has blessed me and my family in a lot of different ways. So I would think that this 7-year journey loosely fits into the second schematic of Micah 6:8 to learning to love mercy with respect to money. Again, I was filled with spiritual pride. Not only was I tithing in full, now I actually hear from God, and I was willing to obey and observe the year of debt forgiveness. So once again, after I was filled with spiritual pride, God then shows me the next leg of the homework, and this was a rough one. he taught me to walk humbly with him. By December 2014, during Christmas break, I started to suffer from panic disorder. And the reason was money. So I immediately figured out that I haven't arrived yet as a steward, because if I did, I should not be so bothered by money such that it would trigger a bout of panic disorder. So what was my money problem at the time? Ever since I started tithing in full in 2007, my income trajectory was like this. It just kept going lower and lower and lower and lower and lower every year. So much for prosperity gospel. It certainly didn't work for me. But there were some expenses that I was unwilling to scale down or adjust. For example, my monthly parental support to my parents, and also my monthly support to my grandmother. And then end of 2009, Sylvia and I got married. The next year we bought our own place. And then Danielle was born in 2011. And then Enoch was born in 2014. So the monthly expenses just kept going up and up and up and up. So basically, starting in January 2014, every month my expenditure exceeded my income. So I had negative cash flow every month. And by year end, during Christmas break, I was staring at this hole of negative cash flow. And I think that's what triggered me to suffer from panic disorder. So I prayed. I said, Lord, I'm not being greedy, but could you please give me a bonus on an after-tax basis such that it would be enough to cover my expenses for the year? And God is, super faithful. A few months later, in the beginning of 2015, he gave me exactly that amount. On an after-tax basis, I was able to balance my expenditure for the previous year. But then I thought, well, God, is this how you want me to carry on living? This is not very fun, to have negative cash flow and then to have to ask you for a way out to break even. Right around the same time, my new pastor said to me, well, Roger, you're on the stewardship committee, and we don't teach about stewardship and generosity on Sundays. We don't talk about it enough. So why don't you go and find a Christian course on finances somewhere and offer it to the congregation? So I brought in the Crown Financial course around early 2015. And when the guest lecturer came in and mentioned the first verse, it was like a pin drop moment. Immediately, I figured out what I had been doing wrong all my life in terms of money. The verse that he quoted was Psalms chapter 24, verse 1, which says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." The mistake that I had made all my life was that I was on a revenue split model with God. The first $100 of income comes in, the first $10 is yours, God, and then the other $90 is mine. How I save it, spend it, invest it, plan for the future, that is my business. Thank you very much. Now, with that kind of spiritual stance, then that's basically kind of saying, Lord, I can figure it out on my own. That 90% of my income, that's going to be enough to provide for me and my family. Now, there's probably nothing more foolish than anyone can do in the whole universe, because we were not designed and wired to handle this amount of stress and responsibility. Throughout the Bible, God says, just trust and obey, and I will provide for you. He is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. And so that became, so I learned that my role is really a steward or a custodian or a fund manager. I'm one of his children. He loves me dearly. He was willing to sacrifice his one and only son to die for me, for my redemption. And if he's willing to do that, is there anything that he's not willing to do for me? Now, having said that, I'm not suggesting that you can sit home and on your couch, watch TV, and money will fall from the skies and hit your account. Work has a very special purpose. And I've discovered over the last 25 years that work is God's means to train our character. Um, your boss, your firm, your business is not your ultimate provider. God is. Because what I learned from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18, is that even our ability to make money, that also comes from God. Just imagine that if God had taken away a single heartbeat, a single breath, if he took away your intellect, your education, and a stable economic environment for you to thrive in, there would be no chance for you to own anything in your account. So this became a very freeing thought to me, and ever since I didn't suffer from another bout of panic disorder. So now, since then, I developed this testimony, and God gave me plenty of opportunity to go to all the small groups in my church to give this testimony. So much so that within a 2-month span, I spoke maybe 20 to 25 times, saying the exact 45-minute testimony. And I got so sick of myself that I thought maybe one day when I have time, I will put down my story in a book, and it would save me time. It will save other people time. They can just read about my journey. But it wasn't the right time to write the book yet. A few months later, in early 2016, I had a business trip to go to Shanghai, and there's a very good friend of mine. He's a very senior banker who lives in Shanghai, and I looked him up for dinner, and he said, "Well, I've got a Bible study tonight. Would you like to come?" And I thought, okay, well, why not? So I get off the plane, I get in the car, and I felt the Holy Spirit nudging me to once again share the same 45-minute stewardship journey that I've experienced. Now, I didn't want to be rude and interrupt the study plans they had, so I called my friend and asked him, "What have you got planned for the Bible study tonight?" He said, "Actually, I've been really busy this week. I haven't planned anything yet." So I said, "Well, would you mind if I share my 45-minute testimony on stewardship?" He said, "Yeah, that would be great. That would save me the hassle of trying to plan something last minute." So I get off the car in a 5-star hotel in Pudong. I get to the Chinese restaurant, and I just assumed that given that this is in Shanghai, the Bible study must be in a private room, right? So I walk off to the private room wing before I checked in with the maitre d', and he's like, "Oh, where are you going? Where are you going?" I said, "I'm looking for Mr. So and so." He said, "No, no, no, he's at the other side." I look over the other side. What's on the other side? It's this vast open dining space, and the maitre d' was pointing at the center table in this large table. I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, doing a Bible study in Shanghai in a pretty public setting. But as I was walking towards the table, I really started to freak out. I thought to myself, why is there a Forbes top 75 global billionaire sitting next to my friend? So, Holy Spirit, you want me to tell that person that the money doesn't really belong to him? You want me to tell him that he shouldn't be so prideful because even his ability to make money came from you, Lord? You want me to tell him that he needs to be a good steward and do more for the poor, etc., etc. So I sat down at the table, very nervous, and then I was very pleased to see that they were serving some very nice champagne. So I popped down 2 glasses, and then I prayed. I said, "Lord, please help me, give me the courage and not water down the message just because there's such and such a person, at the table. But Lord, if you're so willing, please give me a brand new download that is so powerful, so filled with wisdom, such that everyone will be edified." Now, friends, when you throw out emergency prayers like this, I've discovered that God actually answers right away. After my bog standard 45-minute stewardship testimony, which I delivered without watering it down at all, God gave me a brand new download, which is going to take 3 minutes for me to go over. And wherever I get a chance to speak in the world, even if I'm only given a 5-minute slot, basically I will have skipped everything I've said up till now, and I would just talk about this download. I've given it a name now. It's called The Ultimate Truth About Money. If I'm honest with you, whenever I hear the words God bless me, I'm really thinking about two things. One is a long and healthy life, and number two, having a lot of money. So let's look at each factor separately. Ever since Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, God has set a cap on our longevity, and that is 120 years. Even Moses only lived to 120 years old. So let's take that as a given, because even despite thousands and thousands of years of advances in medical sciences, we still don't see anyone living, up to 200 years old. So let's take that as a given. At the time when I wrote this book, Bill Gates was the richest person in the world. At the time, he was worth 90 billion US dollars. So let's say that God loves you even more. He gives you 120 billion US dollars. So you have 120 billion US dollars, you live for 120 years. So simple math is that's $1 billion US dollars a year. Now, I think if we spent 3 seconds to imagine what kind of lifestyle that would be like, I think it's not unfair to assume that we would think it's luxurious, it's comfortable, and that it's stress-free. Now, innately, as human beings, whether we're of faith or whether we're atheists, there's one understanding we all have in common, and that is you cannot bring money with you beyond the grave. But let's just say for a moment, God loves you so much. He's so generous with you that he allows you to bring that 120 billion US dollars with you beyond the grave, and you successfully land in heaven. Friends, this is precisely the moment your problem begins. Now, why do I say that? This sounds very counterintuitive, right? How long is eternity? I think as an approximation that doesn't even do it justice, 120 years that we get to live on Earth, I think we need to add at least another 120 zeros after that. Less than a minute ago, when we did the simple math for 120 billion divided by 120 years, we came up with adjectives such as luxurious, comfortable, and stress-free. But now, with the same 120 billion US dollars, you bring it beyond the grave and you land in heaven. But now you're dividing that by 120 followed by 120 zeros. What's the answer to that? It's 0.00001. You cannot even get a grain of rice with that. So the ultimate truth about money is that no matter how much money you have, and even if you can bring it beyond the grave, it is still not going to cut it. We need to be rich towards God. Jesus talks about this more than anything else in the Gospels. And in Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 33, he says specifically that we need to swap for purses that don't wear out, and that we need to have, and that we ought to be wise and choose to be wealthy in the right time bucket. If you ask a child, do you want to be rich for 1 minute or do you want to be rich for a year? I think anyone would rationally answer you they want to be rich for the longer time period. So what's our lifetime compared to eternity? It's inconsequential. So in closing, I want to encourage you to honor God, because those who honor God, God will honor them. This is from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30. So if you honor God in your finances, God will honor you in your finances. This is not prosperity gospel. I'm not suggesting even for a moment that your giving to get, but rather this is just how God has hardwired the universe in terms of provision. So may this be a blessing to you. May you be richly blessed so that you could be a blessing to many others. Thank you.